Meagan Fisher.
Hi guys, thanks for the warm welcome. Sorry about making you wait a little bit. Yeah, as Mark said, my name is Meagan Fisher, and I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about designing for today's web, working in a post-PSD world, which is kind of a bullshit title. Let me just start out by saying that. When Mark asked me to do this, I was like, I'm sure I'll have something related to design process to talk about by then, so I just kind of came up with it on the fly. Since I started talking about working in a post-Photoshop world, I've kind of gotten a lot of pushback from people who love Photoshop and are like, how can you say we're not going to use it anymore? So I feel the need to clarify up front that it's not that we won't be working in Photoshop anymore, it's just that the way we use it is going to be very different. For me, I used to use Photoshop to kind of create these pixel-perfect mock-ups. I was the best at like seamlessly blending textures using various filter modes and things like that. And we actually have a nickname for this at Chartbeat, which is the startup where I work. We call this pixel fucking. So it's not so much that we're living in a post-PSD world, it's more that we're living in a post-pixel fucking world. And this has kind of been a hard reality for me to face up to, because I always considered myself something of an expert pixel fucker. And really, that was how I got all my work, right? Was people would see the fact that I knew how to make a button pop just so off the page, or that I could craft these beautiful mock-ups using all these different gradients and lighting effects. And that was sort of like my bread and butter. And that's no longer the priority for what we do as web designers. So as part of that, I had to kind of rethink my entire process. So the new priority has really become giving users the easiest access to the best content. Our websites are primarily a means of delivering content or telling a story, right? And that's kind of the new bottom line. Nobody really cares if you know how to use radial gradients anymore. They just want to know if you're good at telling the story. It sounds really obvious and straightforward, but a lot of major websites still get this completely wrong. This is an example of the Huffington Post, and when you first load this page, it's like, where is the article? I don't even know if I want to read this thing. I have to scroll past at least 800 pixels of bullshit to get to the content, right? And then it's set in 12-point, and it's buried between a bunch of ads and images. So giving users easiest access to the best content isn't always as straightforward as you might think. It's also, you have to kind of explore that and think, well, what do we mean by the best content? The best content is something that's constantly shifting over time. And we can no longer just sort of have these rigid boxes where we're like, this is the word count for what you're allowed to put here. Because people expect websites to be dynamic. And anytime you create that kind of rigid structure, your website automatically will have a short lifespan. So giving users access to the best content isn't always a straightforward thing. Also, giving users the easiest access to the best content isn't always clear, because we never know where our users are coming from nowadays. We can't really make any assumptions anymore about how people are going to be viewing our content. So even though it sounds straightforward, this shit is really, really hard. We have to give people who are accessing our content on dozens of different devices the best access to it, but that content is constantly shifting, and it's a huge challenge. So this is something that we're still trying to figure out. And thankfully, a lot of new tools have emerged over the last few years to make this easier for us. And it's a really exciting time to be a web designer, because we have, every 6 months or so, we have sort of these new techniques come out that completely revolutionize the way we think about our work. So when I was faced with this kind of new goal and this new challenge for how I think about web design, I had to completely rethink my process. And so I want to kind of break down for you today the stages of how I work now. I had to come up with a completely different plan of attack. And the 4 steps that I sort of work within are content strategy, design prototyping, creating a visual style, and surprising and delighting. So that all sounds kind of straightforward and linear, and you'd think that it would be like a fairly easy thing to do. But really, this is more what my design process looks like. It's constantly shifting. Actually designing websites is like a totally chaotic thing, and even if you have like this really strict structure for how you'd like to work, it almost never works out that way. You often go down these random tangents and kind of get lost in these like shitty ideas that don't work out. So when I talk about design process, I definitely don't mean to set this up as a mandate or like how you should work every time, because I know that a lot of times you have to kind of iterate as you go. I really just want to start a dialogue about the way that we work and get you thinking about how you might change up your own process. So let's kick things off with the first step, which should be content strategy. If our goal has become to give users the easiest access to the best content, there's no way we can do this by creating a static template that's just full of placeholder text that shows how the design might work possibly in one browser or how we wish it would work. The two just don't align anymore. So anytime you send a client a design that has a lot of lorem ipsum, you're basically saying to them, I don't really give a shit about your content. I just view it as something that I can kind of wrap my beautiful visuals around. It really ends up just creating like a template more than a website, and it focuses on aesthetics more than anything. The way that I used to always think about web content was like something that we would slap in sort of at the last stage of the process. We would bring in a copywriter, and I would be like, here's exactly how many words I need you to put inside this beautiful drop shadowy box. And that really can't be the way we approach it anymore. This has to be kind of the main ingredient in the work we do. As Karen McGreen said in her awesome talk, content strategy will make or break your process. We also just can't hide behind the pixels anymore, right? Like as a designer, you think, oh, well, as long as I know my way around Photoshop well enough, then like I'll always get work, but it's not about that anymore. Instead of just opening a new canvas in Photoshop and pixel fucking it to death, you have to actually get out there and have conversations with people. And this is kind of what Aaron was talking about yesterday with being empathetic. So the first people that you need to form a really good relationship with when you're making a website are your content creators. And this doesn't mean just sitting down with them and saying, I want a doc with all the copy that you think you need to have on this website. It's really about initiating that conversation. And this is something Mark Bolton wrote in a blog post called Structure First, Content Always. And I have literally said this verbatim to clients just to like kick off a content strategy meeting. He says, we'd really like to understand the type and structure of the content for this project. Don't worry, you don't have to write anything yet, just help us to understand. And that's really what it's all about. So for example, at the company where I work, Chartbeat, it sounds a little bit weird like shark beat, but it's charts and then beat. We are launching a new product for this like ad sales service. And so I was tasked with coming up with the marketing site for the product. And when I sat down with our VP of marketing and our content strategist and our head of brand, I was like, okay guys, so what is our top level goal for this marketing site? And they said, well, obviously to get people to sign up for the service. And so we kind of went through an ongoing process of just pushing that further and further. Like, how do we do that? Well, we need to be able to effectively communicate to our users that they have a problem, and we understand what that problem is, and we have the solution for them. And this is kind of like the same sort of structure that you apply to a lot of marketing sites. It's explaining to clients or to users that we understand their goals and their struggles, right? It comes back to empathy, and then that they can trust us to offer the right solution. So we start to think about, like, how do we establish that they can trust us to offer that solution and that we really understand what their problem is. So as I said, for this content strategy kickoff meeting, you really want to get all the stakeholders in the room and ask them to kind of break down what their goals are for the site. This first image that you see in the foreground is literally what the VP of marketing wrote on a whiteboard when I said, can you talk to me a little bit about what you're thinking about for this site? So sometimes this can be a really chaotic meeting, and you really have to kind of push them to get clarity around what the goals are. The awesome thing is that at Chartbeat, we have these giant rolling whiteboards that are in every room, and there's like one next to every other person's desk. So there's lots of opportunities to kind of sketch this out and break down what everybody wants until you get it right. And when you walk away from this meeting, really what you're looking to get is a content inventory. So it's just like a list of the types of content that you need for the page. This is what we came up with for the Chartbeat project. We knew that we wanted to have clear text describing the problem, the steps that we take in order to provide a solution for users, a breakdown of our technologies so that the nerds who are using our product can kind of understand where we get our data from and believe us that it's real. A video from our product creators really helps to kind of build empathy and create that trust so that they see who we are and see our passion that we put into building our products. And then we also wanted to have a prominent testimonial from somebody who's an expert in the field that kind of backs up what we're saying. And from this content inventory, you can kind of already see your design start to take shape, right? As the designer, I can think about how I might style a testimonial to ensure that it's prominent and readable. And a video is like you kind of know what media you're going to need there. So the great thing about this is that you can kind of already envision how the site's going to live just from having conversations with the stakeholders and the users. So as I said, you can kind of start sketching in that meeting how your plan is for arranging that content. The awesome thing about this is that rather than having just a giant list of text, you have individual content modules. It's more of a system that you can sort of rework and rearrange as you need to. So like this was my original sketch, and this might be where we end up. But the core content is still there, and you have that flexibility to shift around. So the most important work that you're going to do as a web designer happens away from your keyboard. And that's something that I really had to learn how to embrace and had to become better as a communicator as part of this whole rethinking of my process. We had to have conversations with the users to understand what their hurdles would be to signing up for our product. We had to talk to the product creators and really understand like why they implemented the solutions they did. And then we also had to have conversations with other people in the industry to kind of immerse ourselves in the context for what we were making. This sounds like a lot of work, and it kind of is. You have to wear yet another hat as a web designer. But really, it makes your job so much easier in the long run. You know, a lot of times the people who are creating content for your site aren't always accustomed to writing copy for the web. At Chartbeat, the person who does most of our copywriting is our head of brand, and she also has to write keynote decks for the CEO when he goes out to present, and white papers that we give away to clients, and all this other different material. So it sort of became up to me as the web designer to guide her in how we might better shape that content for the web. The awesome thing about this is that it makes it easier for you when it comes time to make choices about your layout and how you style the content. You can really defend your decisions to other people because you've done all the research and you've been part of those conversations that happen that led up to that decision making. So it's no longer about, well, this looks pretty or it feels good. You have all that behind you to back you up in your decision making. So once you have your content outline in place, which is really what you're walking away with from that content strategy meeting, the next step is to start thinking about how you would prototype your design. This is a great quote from Charles Eames, who was a furniture designer, an architect, a graphic designer. He worked with his wife, Ray Eames, to build all this beautiful stuff. But he says, design is a plan for arranging elements in such a way as to best accomplish a particular purpose. And it sounds really straightforward, right? But we can totally apply this to the way we think about web design. And that's really what we're doing when we build our design prototype, is coming up with a plan for arranging our elements to accomplish a particular purpose. I'm going to bring this up a lot, but our particular purpose as web designers is simply to give users the easiest access to the best content. And so when we do our design prototype, that's what we're coming up with a plan for. The awesome thing about doing this is that while you're working on that prototype, your content creator can be working in parallel to refine the content that you discussed in your content strategy kickoff meeting. So after the content strategy kickoff meeting, you go back to your DOS or wherever, and you're crafting the CSS template for how you think that content will live based on the conversation you had, and she's there at her desk writing the copy that you discussed in that meeting. So rather than impatiently waiting on one or the other, you guys can be working in tandem. As I mentioned a second ago, I create this design prototype directly in the browser using CSS. People use lots of different tools to wireframe, and for me, just prototyping directly in the browser has been the fastest and easiest way to communicate how I want to lay out my content. There are lots of great reasons to do it this way. For example, you no longer have to create a folder of device.psd files. Especially if you're making something responsive, it's almost impossible to communicate that through a series of static templates. This is an example of when I tried for a project at Chartbeat, and you really don't get a feel for how that interaction is going to be. And also, it's kind of ridiculous to have like an iPhone.psd and an iPad.psd, considering the range of devices that fall in between those resolutions. So when you can see the content directly in the context of the browser and how it's going to adapt for different sizes, it makes it much easier to edit it accordingly and see how it's going to live in all those different environments right from the beginning. You also no longer have to create those ridiculous interaction.psd files that show like every potential hover and click state for everything in the site. You can also, if you have some other kind of interaction that is showing or hiding the content, such as like a slideshow or a lightbox, you can show that directly in the wireframe too, so clients can get a feel for how that's going to behave, and you don't have to describe it with a series of Photoshop files. So another thing I joke about a lot in the office is that when you design something in Photoshop and hand it off to a developer, a lot of times it gets what I call monkey Jesus. Did you guys see this when it was going around the internet like a while back? It's kind of an old internet joke now, but for those of you who don't know about it, it's this 80-year-old woman in Spain volunteered to restore a mural, and on the left was the original, and on the right is what she came up with. And sorry that I keep sniffling, by the way, I have a cold, not like a Coke habit or anything like that. I'm from New York, I didn't want you guys to make assumptions. So anyways, a lot of times when we design these beautiful pixel-perfect comps and hand them off to a developer, things kind of get lost in the mix, right? So this is an example of a visualization that I came up with for one of our Hack Week projects. And since it involved like a lot of complex JavaScript that I don't know how to do, I decided to kind of circumvent the whole CSS thing and just create a PSD and hand it off to one of my dev friends to build. And so this is what I suggested to him. And this is what he came up with. And this is not to disparage him at all, it's just that these kinds of things happen all the time when designers and developers work together. Some of you may be devs and you're like, what's wrong with that? It looks exactly the same. Which is what he said to me. So this is kind of just a quote from Jeffrey Zeldman that sums that up, right? Like anytime you're designing something in Photoshop and handing it off to someone else to build in CSS, they're going to have to make some guesses and some assumptions about what it is that you intended. And depending on who you're working with, those assumptions may not always be the best thing. So really the awesome thing about just designing directly in the browser and prototyping your designs in HTML and CSS is that you're building your designs in the environment where they're ultimately going to be living. So from the very beginning, you're working with semantic, standards compliant HTML, you're thinking about accessibility, and you've already created a great foundation for your website. So rather than having a series of deliverables along the way that are just sort of like approximations of how the website will look, you have the thing from the very beginning that you're going to be making. It also helps you to kind of set the correct expectations along the way. So instead of saying to clients, oh, the type will probably look something sort of like this, but we can only really do this in IE 9 and up, you can show it to them in every potential context as you work. So getting back to our wireframe, you really want to work the wireframe and spend a ton of time in it. A lot of times, the content that you thought was going to work in your initial kickoff strategy meeting makes no sense once you see it actually living in the browser, or when you see it as it's going to be on an iPhone. So a lot of times, I'll sit down with our content creator, and we'll look at the CSS wireframe that I've come up with and start editing copy directly in the DOM. Like, she actually knows her way around the web inspector now, and we'll be like, oh, that headline doesn't really work, and we'll just like go in there and change it on the fly. And the awesome thing about that is that it's just so much faster than to prototype than her like updating a Google Doc and me updating a Photoshop file and back and forth. So you can really work the wireframe until you get the content to a place that you're happy with, and then present that to the stakeholders and go back and say, here's the output of what we came up with in that content strategy meeting. Is this still kind of in line with our goals as we set them out to be? This is just like a quick example of one of these that I created recently for a landing page that we had to do at Chartbeat. And as you can see, it doesn't really have any style, but all the copy is in place. And this is what we're presenting to clients, is this like grayscale designed prototype for how the design's going to be. That's just like the bottom half of the page when you scroll. So a lot of people are really shocked that I would want to present unstyled designs to clients. And this was a huge thing for me to overcome at first. Like, I used to basically like want to sit with a cloak around my head and my display until the design was pixel perfect and not let anybody see it or touch it in the meantime, because I didn't want them to know like how flawed and broken things could be along the way. And this is something you kind of have to get over. Loop your stakeholders in early and often, and welcome constant feedback, because it's much easier to iterate on your designs when they're in HTML and CSS, so you won't be as averse to getting people's input along the way. The awesome thing about showing clients unstyled mockups is that you no longer have like the hovering art director who's like, make that purple just a little bit more purple, or make that button 3 pixels bigger. Like, you can get their input, but they're purely giving feedback on whether or not we're telling the right story or getting the message across. No more like backseat pixel fucking. And yeah, like I said, feedback minus the hovering art director. And just as a side note, if you guys haven't seen hoveringartdirectors.tumblr.com, all the designers out there, I think, will really appreciate it. It's just a collection of people standing around your screen and like pointing at things, and there's usually like 7 of them in the background. This is that happening to me at Chartbeat. It happens all the time. So the one exception to the rule of not spending a lot of time on style early on in your process is typography. And the reason for that is, at this point, we're all about expressing the content and making sure that we're telling the message in the right way. And if you don't spend at least a little time on your type, that's going to get lost. And you won't really be able to evaluate the effectiveness of your content without some time spent styling type. In case you couldn't read that last slide, this is what it said. Good design gets lost with bad, or good content gets lost with bad typography. So this is kind of a long quote, but when I read this article, Web Design is 95% typography, it sort of opened my mind up to the role that type has to play in our process and where it should fall in the stages of building a website. Oliver Reichenstein, you guys can probably all pronounce that better than I can, says, ask yourself which text is functional, which text is passive, systematize them, create an interface, and the rest will add up automatically. Until you have resolved readability issues, don't even think about changing colors, thickening lines, pushing pixels, or choosing pictures. And this was a huge revolution for me. There were years where I would just kind of think about the type last, and a lot of times it was like, oh, I can just use Georgia for headlines and Helvetica for body copy, or if I'm feeling really crazy, I'll switch it up. And I always use 1.5M for line height, and that's it. Type is easy, right? And now I've realized that there's so much more to it than that, and there's so much more that you need to think about when you're trying to express the content, and type is really just like the key to getting that message across. So for those of you who are like not sure about your ability with typography or want to brush up on your skills, I actually had like 10 slides about that, and then I realized that that was going to turn this into a 2-hour talk instead of a 45-minute one. So I'm just going to throw some resources up that you can look at that will help you get a lot better at typography really quickly. There's a pocket guide from the from Mark Bolton's series, 5 Simple Steps, called Combining Typefaces by Tim Brown, that I would definitely recommend you guys check out. Also, Jason Santamaria wrote an A List Apart article, like, I think 2 years ago now or something, called On Web Typography, that really helped to kind of open my eyes about designing type for the web. And he's also coming out with a book from A Book Apart this year that I'm really looking forward to, so keep your eyes out for that. And then Jessica Hish just last week released an article that's kind of like a summary of a talk she gave at an event apart called Upping Your Type Game, and it's awesome, so definitely look that up. Also, I will have these slides available as a PDF after I give this talk, so you guys don't have to write this down right now if you don't want to. One last typography resource that I'd like to mention is Typophile. It's kind of like a good cheat sheet for if you're just getting started with type and you want to like not mess things up too badly or just know what all the different like styles are that you have to consider. So basically, it has like a drop-down menu that lets you select from a couple different themes, and then you can download the CSS right there. And the other cool thing about this site is that when you're reading the like filler copy for it, it's actually guidelines on how to understand good typography principles. So if for nothing else, you could definitely check that out. So up until now, I haven't really talked too much about responsive design or really dug deep into that. I've mentioned that you should be making responsive prototypes. And part of the reason for that is that I'm really looking forward to hearing what Brad and Elliot and Josh have to say about this later today, so I don't want to steal their thunder, I guess. But I will say a little bit about the work I've been doing with mobile-first responsive design. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's basically designing for the smallest device first, and then building your design outward to adapt for larger displays. And really, when we talk about mobile-first design, what we're talking about is just content-first design. The reason we would want to do this is that it's good for business, obviously, it's good for users, and it's good for you. I'm not going to read you guys all the statistics on why mobile is important. I think everybody kind of knows that it's a big deal by now. But you can definitely check these out. Luke Weblerowski, I can never say his name, has a ton of resources and has written about this, actually also for A Book Apart. He wrote a book called Mobile First Design. So yeah, obviously anytime we can guarantee that our sites are going to work for every user in every potential context, that should sound really good to business people, right? Like, I can guarantee that nobody is not going to get the message with my design. Mobile design is also awesome for us because it really helps to kind of clarify what kind of content is important. This is a quote from Matt Marquis. He says, mobile users want to see our menu, hours, and delivery number, but desktop users definitely want this 1 megabyte ping of someone smiling at a salad. And this is like totally true when you look at restaurant websites. They're completely ridiculous on desktop, but a lot of times the mobile context, if they have one, is much more straightforward. We can also see examples of this in more complicated interfaces. This is a quote from Joe Hewitt, a designer at Facebook. He says, "My goal was initially just to make a mobile companion, but I became convinced it was possible to create a version of Facebook that was actually better than the website." And this is something he totally achieved. When I go to Facebook, there's pretty much only one thing I want to see, which is the status updates of my friends and family. And that's where they are, and the rest is just they're completely buried in like a lot of crap that I don't want, like ads and Farmville status updates and all that kind of nonsense. But the difference is that the mobile app just makes this immediately apparent and gives me immediate access to what I'm looking for. So for a long time, I would only use Facebook on my iPhone. I wouldn't even go to it on the desktop site. So the arguments for mobile-first design are pretty compelling, and you would think that it would be a straightforward thing. But it's actually something that's really hard to implement directly in your process. You have to completely rethink the way you design and learn new best practices for designing in different contexts. And this is a big challenge to do when you're working under a deadline and you have clients expecting you to just get something out. And most of the time, they only care about the desktop version of the site. So a lot of times, like, clients don't even buy why this matters. When I was working on the new page at Chartbeat, they were like, well, only 2% of our users are even accessing it from mobile devices. So why are you telling me we should like give you 2 extra weeks to ensure this works for them? And it kind of becomes a catch-22. It's like, well, maybe only 2% of our users are using it on a mobile device because it doesn't work right now. So the hardest part of implementing mobile-first design is not so much understanding the technical side of it, but learning how to educate clients on why it matters and why it's worth giving the time to. And also, as you get better at it, it won't take up so much time in your process, and really, in the long run, it can end up saving you a lot of time. But that's really hard to do. I think I have this slide in here like 3 times, because it's true. This shit is hard. So moving on to the next step, I want to talk a little bit about visual style and how we kind of take that prototype and that wireframe we've built and really bring it to life. But first, I'm going to get a little more water. So you might think that since we're finally getting to the visual style part of the talk, that you would get to open Photoshop now. But not really, sorry. I want to mention, because I haven't up until now, that you also want to be looping in your developers along the way. The cool thing about building your prototype in HTML and CSS is that once you've taken it to the point where your markup is ready to go, you can then hand it off to developers to start building out any functionality that's needed without them waiting around for you to finish refining your design, which is really awesome. So rather than having this sort of waterfall process of like PSD, developer, content coming in at the last minute, everybody's kind of working in tandem. As I said before, all your good designs are going to happen because of the good conversations you have up front. And before you can start thinking about visual style or working in Photoshop, you need to have another sit down with the stakeholders to talk about what they're envisioning for the visual style of the site. Really what this is about is synthesizing brand goals. Yesterday, I was looking at my slides a little bit during James's talk, and this one was up at some point when he was talking about the amazing work he's doing and fuck your boring day job. And I looked at the headline of the slide and I was like, synthesize brand goals, I'm awesome. But here we are. So, a lot of times what this used to mean for me was kind of sitting down and being like, send me a list of your competitors, what's your favorite color? These kinds of like really huge client questionnaires that you see a lot of agencies use. And something I've started doing in these kickoff meetings that's a little bit different and makes the conversation a little bit more engaging is to ask like a series of seemingly ridiculous questions, such as, if your site was a car, what would it be and why? And really the interesting part of this is not so much what car they would pick, but what they say when you ask the and why, and what they describe the feeling of their site that they want it to be, whether they want it to be fast and sleek, or practical, or trashy. I would love to design a site that was based on an El Camino, by the way. You can kind of frame this in a lot of different contexts. It doesn't have to just be about cars, but it can be like, what kind of city would your site be? Does anybody know what the last one is? You get major nerd points if you do. Of course you do. Okay, thought that was going to be a challenge. I would also love to design a site based on Tatooine. Anyways, another like kind of fancy term that gets thrown around for this is doing a semantic differential survey, which is basically like playing a word association game with your clients where you say, you know, would you describe your site as modern or classic, serious or fun, Barack or George, I don't know. And it's the cool thing about this is that even though like it's only moderately useful, right, to you to like have this kind of list of adjectives, but clients love doing it. And they get so involved in like playing these kinds of games and coming up with, you know, talking about their preferences that you can really start to get like a good feel and a good energy for what they're looking for from the site. So it's more about like kind of creating that empathy and really understanding where they're coming from than actually having a list of like their sites more like Barack Obama and Paris than, you know, Las Vegas and George Bush. So that's kind of what that part of the meeting is all about. The next thing you want to do is think about how you can kind of bridge that gap between your grayscale wireframe and your mockup. And for a lot of people, this means creating something like a style tile, which is sort of a relatively new deliverable that Samantha Warren, I think, first coined the term for, but a lot of people have been doing it to come up with ways to like not create these fully fledged mockups, but still express what they want the style of their site to be. As I said, all the cool kids are doing it nowadays. So this is some examples of style tiles from Samantha's original article about it. And basically this is just like another way to continue that discussion around what the preferences are for the client's design. So you can kind of synthesize the conversation that you had earlier about what the brand goals are into what you think would express that best visually. This is an example of some style tiles from Clear Left, and they actually wrote about their process for using style tiles in this blog post that I would recommend you guys check out. So in addition to like just taking a few different colors and mixing up a couple different type schemes, you can come up with completely different styles. So here they've done one that's like very illustrative, one that's very scrapbooky, and that's just like another way to sort of approach it, have like completely unique palettes to work from. I don't really do this, to be honest. Style tiles still feel a little bit too pixel fucky for me, and also I tend to get like really attached to them, and then I'm getting further and further away from the browser as I'm creating style tiles. And for me, it's really all about just keeping my work going back into CSS as often as possible. So really, I just start with like a basic color palette, and maybe I'll suggest like what the primary call to action could be styled like. This is actually like the palette we're using for the marketing site at Chartbeat that we send out to new designers just to kind of give them an idea of like what we're working with. But as you can see, it's still pretty open-ended. And that's because I want everybody to be working in the browser as much as possible and not thinking too much about how those pixel-perfect little tiles are going to be. So the other reason to get back in the browser as soon as possible is a lot of times the colors that you think work in your style tile actually look like shit when they're implemented in the designs. This happened to me where I kind of came up with this like beautiful color scheme and graphics that I thought would be great that I could implement into my prototype. And so I did that, and I started working with them in the CSS, and one of the developers pulled them up on like his shitty monitor, and I don't know if you guys have that too, but all the developers at our company have like the worst screens, and the designers have cinema displays. But it's actually really valuable because you get to see how the designs are going to look for the rest of the world. So yeah, you need to be testing these ideas like constantly and seeing if it works on different displays. How does this color scheme feel on the iPhone versus the iPad? Sometimes it's like too overpowering and bright when looked at in a smaller context. And so the other awesome thing about like implementing on design in the browser is that you can use CSS3. Like I use HSL to set all my colors because as a designer, it's really intuitive to adjust the saturation to make something a little bit brighter or to adjust the lightness right there in my markup rather than going back to Photoshop and editing my style tile and then re-implementing it. So basically, I would just advocate before you spend too much time in Photoshop that you take your design as far as you can in CSS. And the response I get about this a lot of times is that it looks so flat. I've made a rule at Chartbeat that flat is the new F word, and like instead of having a swear jar for every time somebody says fuck, shit, damn, you have to put a coin in the flat jar every time you talk to me about how flat my designs are. So I'm going to talk about flat design for a while and break my own rules. As I said, like for a long time, my design style was very pixel fucky. It was like all about textures and rich gradients and glossy effects. And it took me kind of a while to step back from that and think about designs that are more simplified. But there's a lot of good reasons to embrace it. It creates a design that's more honest. Also, your designs are going to look way better on Retina. I think actually the thing that got me to kind of change up my style was that I got a Retina MacBook Pro, and I was like, man, all those textures look like garbage on this thing. And then I was like, okay, now I'm convinced. And you're also going to be creating much smaller websites when you sort of embrace flat design. So this is kind of a relatively long quote from Alan Grinstein, who is the designer at Laravel, and they kind of coined this term of like flat design. But basically he says, designing honestly means recognizing things you can do with screens and input devices can't be done with physical objects. More importantly, that we shouldn't try copying them. Can you imagine if your iPhone was built into the body of an antique telephone headset? And this is so true. This is like what we've been doing as designers, right? Is trying to emulate these kind of real-world objects in a digital context, and it doesn't really make sense. Like, we can just embrace the digital content as its own medium. We no longer have to pretend that a button is like a physical, real-world button. It's more honest if we're presenting our web designs as living in the environment that they do. John Gruber also wrote a really great article about this and sort of what flat design has to do with the context of like the iOS design, which is really interesting because now the rumor is that Johnny Ive is going to be creating a more flat iOS 7. So I can't wait to see what happens with that. But he basically touches on what I just said, which is that these kind of glossy, heavy-handed designs with lots of depth and shadow don't really make sense in a Retina context, which is where we're moving. And you would never see somebody really do that in print design, right? Like create this big sort of faux drop shadow on something on a poster, or pretend that a poster has a canvas texture by layering it into the file somehow. And that's kind of like something that we can take into web design now that we have these beautiful high-resolution displays. That's not to say that you don't get to pixel fuck ever, right? Because my heart would probably break if I couldn't like play with radial gradients sometimes or incorporate drop shadows every now and then. It's just that you don't want to just universally kind of apply that style to everything you do. Now we can be a little bit more selective with what gets pixel fucked and what doesn't. And we can base those decisions around the content. So I want to show you guys two websites I created. One was a year ago, and one was just about a week ago. The first one is 1.3 megabytes, and the second one is a third that size. This was the original Chartbeat homepage. We're working on redesigning it now. As you can see, every single section has its own separate gradients and textured backgrounds, and every little illustration has like 45 layers of grain effect and various gradients. This is a new page that we're sort of still in the process of working on, but just to give you an idea, it's like a wireframe we've been taking and styling. And it's pretty much done, almost. I kind of want to tweak some of those graphics still. But yeah, it's a third the size. And it actually does a much better job of communicating the message because the text doesn't get lost in all of that ridiculous heavy imagery that we had on the first version. And it loads much faster, and it's going to work on mobile devices. So the last thing I want to talk about quickly, I'm running out of time, is it's like almost the most important thing you can do for your designs. It's really, really important. So just because it's last doesn't mean it doesn't matter. You want to find ways to kind of incorporate elements of polish into your design and surprise your users and delight them. So that can be done in a lot of different ways. The work we've been doing up until this point is like not the work that's that fun for us as designers, right? Like it's not going to get us on the popular page of Dribbble to have like a grayscale wireframe that works on an iPad. So this is where you really get to do the stuff that like gets you off. And pixel fuck and like add that level of polish that's fun for us to do, and the stuff that we used to start with. So this is just like an example of two graphics I created. The first one is the one that I did like when I was going through the visual style process, and it's just like a very basic browser with some little text boxes over it. And the second one is one that I came up with during this kind of like polishing phase of the work, where it's not that different. The message is still kind of the same, but you've taken the time to apply that level of polish that really helps your work to shine. Another great way to do this is to incorporate interesting animations and interactions in your site, and Squarespace does a really good job of this. Even though they have an incredibly simple design that's pretty much purely typography based and has like very muted colors, they've really brought their site to life by having these kind of subtle interactions. And they could have launched it with static imagery and it would have told essentially the same story, but they've just taken it to that extra step that really helps to kind of drive the message home. I have to mention Laravel. They do a really great job of this too. Like all these fun little animations don't necessarily like make that big of a difference in your understanding of the content, but it makes the site just so much more memorable, and it's something you want to keep coming back to and revisiting because of these kinds of fun interactions. And that's a really important step in our design as well. This doesn't always have to be something that's like, you know, beautiful and memorable and elegant animations. Jessica Hish did an awesome thing with her site just for fun, where you can click on a heart and toggle it into teen girl mode, as she calls it. I'm pretty sure I had a live journal that looked exactly like this back in the day. And I mean, this is kind of like a pointless thing, right? But it's these sort of fun exercises and these fun moments of surprise that really help people to remember who you are and what your design is about or what your brand is about. So these kinds of little extra steps are basically the icing on your already delicious cake. Don't worry, it's almost lunchtime. I was so hungry when I wrote this slide last night. I was already thinking about lunch. Anyways, so as I've been kind of saying throughout, being a web designer has gotten a lot harder lately, right? Like it's no longer about just making something pretty in Photoshop. You have to kind of like play all these different roles. You have to know HTML and CSS really well. And not just that, you have to understand how to make it adapt for a bunch of different devices. And you have to know how to talk to people about content strategy and interview people about what they're looking for and add kind of elements of fun to your design. But it also makes being a web designer a lot more awesome. Like, now I no longer feel like I'm just kind of stuck behind the screen and I'm like a tool in a process of an assembly line. I get to get out there and talk to people and interact and like feel like you're a very integral part of the website that you're building, which is great. And as I kind of said at the beginning, there are no real right answers for how you design websites. This is a great quote from Steve Krug? I don't know. He says, "The problem is that there are no simple right answers for most web design questions, at least not the important ones. What works is good integrated design that fills a need, carefully thought out, well executed, and tested." And here he's kind of talking about coming up with solutions for the design, but I think the same thing is true of your process. It's also something you're going to have to spend a lot of time thinking about and iterating on. And mine is constantly evolving, too. This is another awesome quote from Charles Eames. He says, "Here's one of the few effective keys to the design problem: the ability of the designer to recognize as many of the constraints as possible, and his willingness and enthusiasm for working in these constraints." So my challenge to you guys is just to sort of accept and embrace these constraints and see how it can kind of unleash your creativity and really make you the best designer that you've ever been. Thank you so much for having me.